Welcome back to the next session, and in this class we are discussing one of the central theoretical arguments of Karl Marx, known as historical materialism. So hope you remember that in the previous class we discussed the intellectual influences on Karl Marx. We spent some time trying to understand what were the dominant theoretical or intellectual streams of thought during Marxian time, or who were the eminent intellectuals or thinkers who influenced Marxian, the development of Marxian thought. We discussed about anarchists, we discussed about young Hegelians, we discussed about Hegel in detail. So we found out that like any other or every other intellectuals, Marx also was heavily influenced by the kind of intellectual orientation of his time. He very fiercely engaged with some of the intellectual currents of his time, very strongly engaged with them, fought with them, quarreled with them, and then came up with his own arguments. So one of the most central theses of Marxian theory is his argument about historical materialism. And as we discussed in the previous class, he borrowed the framework of dialectics from Hegel, rejected the framework of idealism. So historical materialism is also sometimes called as dialectical materialism, because he is using the framework of dialectics and use that framework to explain the material conditions of the world, whereas Hegel used the framework of dialectics to explain the conditions of ideas, how ideas evolve from one state to the other through the process of dialectics. Whereas Marx was extremely critical of the emphasis Hegel accorded to ideas, and rejected that, and then argued that the material has primacy over, or it has dominance, or it has primacy over the mind or the ideas, and then argued that you need to develop a method, you need to develop a theory to explain how material conditions underwent transformations over a period in time by incorporating a methodology of dialectics. So Marx had both an empirical theory of history and a speculative philosophy of history. So what does that mean? Every historian, in the true sense of the word, provides you an empirical history of an empirical account of history, isn't it? They provide you an account about how human society evolved or changed over a period in time. What were the actual empirical historical facts? So Marx exactly provides such kind of an account. He was an historian who provided you with a very reliable, empirically reliable, factual historical account like any other historian or any other social scientist. At the same time, he also provided a speculative philosophy of history. And philosophers, as they are the people who can speculate, who can theorize, who can imagine, and who can make very predictive statements, Marx also did that. So Marxian theory or Marxian history has this dual characters. The former, which has come to be known as historical materialism, is a set of macro sociological generalizations about the cause of stability and change in societies, as we will see, because Marx has a very fascinating account about how societies transformed from that of primitive communism, when human beings lived as hunters and gatherers, from that to slavery, to feudalism, and to capitalism, and finally he predicted that human beings will move to a state of socialism, and finally that of communism. So that is a macro sociological generalizations. The latter, largely of Hegelian inspiration, offers a scheme of interpreting all historical events in terms of their contributions to realizing end of history, in both sense of the term. End of history, as for Hegel, this Western civilization during his time, it reached the zenith of human activity or human progress, because they have identified reason, and Hegel believed that the people of his time have reached the zenith, they have reached the top, and also both as the end of the history. Based on the materialist conception of the world, human history as the history of human labor and class struggles. Now, from here onwards, we are no longer discussing his Marxian engagement with Hegel, but we try to grasp, we try to understand what were the original arguments of Marx and his understanding about social change. So, based on a materialist conception of the world, human history has to be seen as the history of human labor and class struggle. And this is the fundamental thesis of Marxian thought. You cannot understand human society, you cannot understand human history without taking into account the central role played by human labor and the central role played by human conflicts in the form of class struggle. The hitherto existing history is the history of class struggle, is a very famous quote from Karl Marx. So, he understood human history so far as a relentless continuation of human struggles or class struggles. So, explained through the framework of dialectics inspired by Hegel, as we discussed earlier. He explained the past, he predicted the future, and very interestingly, as you know, that prediction did not come true. As I told you, it was a meta theory that Marx presented. It was a theory that was supposedly capable of explaining every society, explaining the transition of human society from the most elementary form to that of his contemporary times, and then he predicted its course in the future. But that did not come true, because Marx predicted the collapse of capitalism, and Marx predicted the emergence of communism as the ultimate state of affairs, and we know that that did not really take place, and provided a host of conceptual tools to understand the process of labor, social structure, social change, and so on. So, you will come across a host of concepts and terms and terminologies that Marx developed, very, very powerful terms to describe the process of labor. He talks about labor power, he talks about surplus labor, a host of other terms and terminologies in each of these disciplines, whether it is in history or political science or in economics, and social structure and social change and so on. Now, we are discussing his work German Ideology, because it is in this work that he most systematically brings out his argument about this historical materialism. Now, as an alternative to the idealist humbug which he characterizes of young Hegelians, Marx argued that theoretical analysis should be empirically based. Okay? So, he was kind of fed up with the kind of arguments by young Hegelians, arguments by Hegel, which completely revolved around the realm of ideas, with scant regard to the kind of empirical reality in which they lived. Social theory, he said, should be grounded on the existence of living human individuals who must survive, often in a relatively hostile environment. So, without looking into the reality that is unfolding in front of you, without looking into the real world in which actual people live and die, any amount of philosophical thinking only becomes an intellectual pastime. It becomes a pastime of the intellectuals, as per Marx. So, he was kind of fed up, and he very mercilessly discarded, outrightly critiqued the idealist orientation of the young Hegelians. So, Marx was asserting that people produced their ideas about the world in the light of social structure in which they live. A beautiful argument, an extremely important argument. Your ideas about the world are many times a reflection of your social structure, the society in which you live and experience that they have in these structures. Furthermore, as social structures change, the content of people's ideas, their consciousness change as well. Okay, it's not the other way around, and here you see a kind of a completely contrary position to that of idealists. For idealists, people believed, they argued that on the basis of ideas that they create the society, whereas Marx argues that your ideas undergo changes in different social epochs, because these ideas are the products of different social settings. These ideas are the products of different social structures in which people live. So, unless you pay attention to the actual social setting, unless you very carefully understand and analyze and theorize the empirical reality of human beings, you will not be able to understand why certain ideas emerge in certain periods in time, or why certain ideas are possible in certain periods in time. For example, he would argue that the idea of individual liberty, idea of capitalism, idea of justice, idea of democracy could not have been emerged in a period of slavery. It couldn't have been emerged in a period of feudalism because the material conditions were not favorable to that. And we will come to such fascinating arguments in the later classes. So this was directly opposed to Hegel's idealism, in which notions of morality, religion and all other forms of awareness are considered to exist independently of human beings. Something that we discussed, because Hegel argues that these ideas are not created by human beings, but rather they are extremely important. Marx did not see the human mind as a passive receptacle, rather he saw it as active, both responding to and changing the material world. So, we know that Marx believed that human beings are the actual agents of change. They are not the passive recipients. They are not the human mind is not a passive receptacle. It is an actual agent that has the ability to change the world. Material factors, especially the production and reproduction of existence through labor, are the driving power in people's lives. The problems facing any society are inseparable from the organization of labor process. Marx states, life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. This is an extremely important and central argument of Marx. Life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. To understand any society, it is necessary to grasp the labor process, the ways in which people transform nature through work. Labor fundamentally shapes people's identities, their sense of who they are. And this is again, and this point you need to keep in mind, because this is something so central, something so foundational in Marxian argument. Whether you need to understand his argument about religion, or his argument about capitalism, his argument about alienation, or his argument about any other Marxian argument, Marxian theory. This is a central argument. Why? That he gives so much of importance to human labor. It is something so central, not only in providing him with all the basic necessities, her with the basic necessities, but this is something so central for a human being to define the human character of that person. Human history is the process of people producing their material lives. Labor produces a definite mode of life, and human nature is dependent on the material conditions of production. The labor process is socially organized in distinct ways in different societies. So Marx is inviting our attention to look at a central process of human existence. How do people produce things that are necessary for them? And how do you understand it historically? This is the simple question that Marx asked. You know that when Marx was talking about his contemporary time, he is talking about a developed capitalist industrial society, beginning of early capitalism in Europe. So he is asking this question: is it how things were produced throughout the history? Then the definite answer is no. You know that if you look at the history, if you look at archaeology, if you look at theory of evolution, human beings have evolved over a period of time. They started their life as hunters and gatherers, did not know agriculture, did not know the use of fire. Later they started cultivation, they started rearing of animals, and later they settled down in certain places. Then then the kind of a gradual growth of human societies in different directions. And Marx argued that to understand all this transformation, you need to understand how the process of production was transformed, how the process of production underwent subsequent changes. Without understanding that, you will not understand human history. Ideas will give you only a partial explanation, because ideas were not the kind of a propelling force. The propelling force was the kind of different modes of production. So he argues that this definite mode of production, a mode of production, we will look at it, analyze its definition in sometime down the line. But he's arguing a mode of life, a definite mode of life is something that is specific material conditions of production. The labor process is socially organized in distinct ways in different societies. So how is this labor is socially organized? Okay, so that's a central concern of Marx. How is the production is socially organized? How societies evolve its own mechanism to organize production? How do different people fulfill their role in the process of production? Who decides what? What kind of work is involved by what kind of people? And that is something important for a Marxian analysis. Every type of productive system presupposes a set of social relations as well as a particular approach to mastering nature. Every productive systems that we will come across, where he makes at least some 3 or 4 categories. He talks about slavery, he talks about feudalism, he talks about capitalism, he has not elaborated communism, but he hints about it, and he has an elaborate discussion about Asiatic mode of production as a definitely different set of mode of production. So every productive system presupposes a set of social relations as well as a particular approach to mastering nature. The reproduction of a people through labor is not accompanied by isolated individuals but by members of a society. So you cannot really decide how you are involved in this process of production. You have very little autonomy in that. Rather, it is a socially defined position. It's a socially defined process, and your individual choice has very little stake in that. As the arrangement of labor becomes more complex, a division of labor emerges. The division of labor distributes the conditions of labor, the tools and materials, into different unequal groups. And this particular argument, division of labor, is again a very, very important category in sociological theory. We will come across an elaborate discussion on division of labor when we discuss Emile Durkheim, because his theory of social change is also centers around this idea of division of labor. So Marx argues that when human society becomes more and more complex, and when they grow in size, a division of labor emerges, and the division of labor distributes the conditions of labor, the tools and materials, into different unequal groups. When we talk about a primitive society, a society of primitive people, for example, a living tribe today, or a people at the very early stages of their human evolution, their life was very simple. There was hardly any division of labor. Everybody does almost every work together, because hunting and gathering food is the fundamental or is the most important job, because they have to look for food for every day, because they don't cultivate, they don't store any food. Every day's hunger needs to be met. So every person, every able-bodied person, irrespective of the gender, is involved in the process of finding food. And that situation changes over a period of time when they become more and more prosperous in terms of material condition, when they have identified agriculture, when they are able to stock food, when they are able to produce more than what they require for their immediate consumption, then the division of labor reaches the next level. And you can just compare it with the contemporary times now. You know that in the contemporary times, only a very few section of people, especially in industrial societies, are involved in the production of food and other material. A vast majority of others are engaged in a host of other specialized activities. And you know that how many of us are actually involved in the process of production of food? Very few of us. A lot of other people are engaged in other specialized activities. So he's talking about how does this transformation take place, and how this transformation, why certain people are engaged in certain activities, and what defines their situation is something central in understanding the history of human society. It promises a more efficient economic system. This division of labor promotes a more efficient economic system that allows a surplus to be created beyond the needs of subsistence. When surplus develops, one group can live off the labor of others, akin to the master's domination over the slave. A very important argument, as we discussed. In a hunting-gathering society, everybody needs to work. But the moment you discover agriculture, when you know that you can cultivate your food grains more efficiently, you can produce more, that everybody does not have to work in the field, then this division of labor also creates a kind of a surplus, so that a group of people can live off the labor of another. So that is the time when human society has begun into the into the direction of specialization of people. For example, teachers as an exclusive category of people, or priests as an exclusive category of people, or similar kind of people, or various artisans, various artists, or musicians. Okay, so these people began to emerge as independent categories because they don't need to really work in the field. There are other people who are working in the field, and these people can engage in certain other thing, and they can live off the labor of another, akin to the master's domination over the slave. Classes arises when the surplus of goods produced by the division of labor can be controlled by a minority of people. This is an extremely important argument of Marx. Now, from a very egalitarian society, you know that in a tribal society there are no class divisions. There could be very few instances of status division. Maybe the chief or the priest of that tribe might enjoy a higher status, or the elderly person might enjoy a higher status, but otherwise economic class simply does not exist in primitive societies. Maybe in a very, very limited sense of somebody who owns more cattle, something like that. But it is no way comparable with the kind of emergence of class that human society has seen in the subsequent situations. So, class arises when a surplus of goods produced by a division of labor can be controlled by a minority of people. Any community in which an elite possesses the surplus is an unequal society. Further, the ways in which the ruling group extracts the surplus from another class provides insights into the type of inequality and exploitation generated in that society. So here Marx is bringing in into the fore the kind of unequal relationship between different set of people and in different periods in history. For example, during slavery, you know that the master, he even owns the slaves. The slave is a property. The slave is a property just like any other physical property. He can be sold, he can be bought, he can be disposed of, he can be killed. Even the very human existence of that slave is denied. Whereas that situation is completely different in a feudal society, and that situation is completely different in a capitalist society. In a capitalist society, as we will see, the capitalist only buys the labor, whereas the laborer himself or herself is a free agent. So now this relation between the group of people who engaged in productive activities and the people who can live off the surplus of people, and the relation between them is something so defining according to Marx. This inequality results in the growth of antagonism, which ultimately lead to social conflicts, and the whole society will move to the next level, where again the same dialectical relationship will take place until the era of communism, where the state will wither away and a classless society will take shape. This is the argument of Marx. So the entire human history, according to Marx, is the history of class struggle, because from the system of slavery to the system of feudalism to system of capitalism, and as he as he formulated the system of communism, this transition from one state to the other takes place because of this antagonism between classes, and that happens in a dialectical manner, because from slavery to feudalism it moves, but this feudalism again has the contradictory tendencies, the opposing ideas, which leads to a conflict, which leads to that of capitalism, which again has its own seeds of opposite ideas, its own seeds of contradiction, which leads to a kind of a completely qualitatively different one, that of communism. And Marx argues, but did not really elaborate properly why and how in a communist society it becomes a classless society and the state will wither away. and he argued even that it leads to the kind of dictatorship of the proletariat, a term which he has not really kind of elaborated, which led to a lot of speculations and formulations by other scholars. So we can the process of dialectics, it's something like this. You have contradictory ideas. This is thesis, this is antithesis, and this leads to a qualitatively different state, which again has this opposite ideas or contradictions inbuilt, that which again leads to a higher plane, qualitatively different one, which again has this opposite ideas. And Hegel calls it negation, and negation of the negation, and it leads to the other one. And in Marxian parlance, it is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and which again leads to thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and finally reaches to the higher level. Now, in order to understand, in order to explain how this, how Marx explains this, we need to understand a Marxian idea of social structure, an extremely important point where Marx talks about. It's a very simplistic argument, but a very powerful argument. Marx conceives of society as constituting a base and a superstructure. So this model, the base and superstructure model, is an extremely famous model and very, very central to the Marxian understanding. So he conceives of social structure, every social structure, okay, not only that of contemporary society, but every social structure as composed of two elements. One is a base, the foundation, on which the superstructure is built. It's something like the structure of a house where there is a foundation and its a superstructure. And what are the elements, or what are the things which make this base and the superstructure? For Marx, the base is composed of the economy. He is very clear about it. It's composed of the economy. It is the realm of production, or he also calls it as mode of production. As we discussed, how a socially organized productive process takes place, how different people in a society are engaged in the process of production in a definitive way. So that constitutes the base. And the superstructure is almost everything else. You name it, whether it is politics or law or literature or ethics or ideology or social norms, everything else what you understand, what you identify in a society are put together in this superstructure. And because of the very nature of base and superstructure, it is understood, or it's been very, it's easy to understand that the economy, the base, is seen as the most important one. And what is the connection between the base and the superstructure? Is it a one-sided direction? Or does Marx talk about a reciprocal relationship between superstructure and base? These are heavily contested arguments. We will take them up later when we discuss a session on ideology. We will take it up later. But more conventional Marxists would argue, or in general Marxian theory would argue, as the enormous influence that the base exerts on the superstructure, and whether Marx uses it as in a deterministic way. An economic deterministic way is again a controversial issue. Whether Marx uses the term determines, because the moment you use the word determines, it provides a kind of an absolutist sense. Everything is completely determined. Or he uses the word something like shapes or influences. Is a matter of debate between different strands of Marxism. So he gives primacy to the economic aspect, the core idea of his materialistic perspective, which we discussed earlier, because for Marx, the realm of economy, the realm of production is central to human existence. By economic, he means specifically the organization of productive activity, how people come together to satisfy their needs for food, shelter and clothing. Marx calls this economic assemblage the mode of production. Okay, how in different epochs in history, how people produced the basic things. As human beings, we make our lives and express ourselves through labor, through our collective interaction with nature. Unlike non-human beings, Marx observes, we must consciously produce our means of subsistence. In the study of human history, therefore, the process of production is the appropriate starting point. Okay? As we mentioned earlier, one of the most unique things that distinguishes human beings from other animals is that we are able to produce our means of subsistence. We are not dependent, of course we are dependent, but we know how to produce our own means of subsistence. And in fact, we produce much more beyond our basic needs. That is why we are, human beings as a species is able to make so much of progress in its life in this world in comparison with others. So we are now beginning to introduce a set of concepts. Very important that you understand these concepts, because these terms will come again and again in the discussion on Marxian terminology. One of the fundamental terms is this mode of production. As we discussed, the very definitive arrangement of production, how a society arranges its people into a specific form of production, socially organized form of production. And as per Marxian argument, this is very definitive to the definitive periods in history. You don't have a single mode of production that starts from the beginning of human civilization to that of the contemporary times. You have different specific modes of production. Okay, and again, this is a hugely debated area. Exactly how many modes of production that Marx identified, it's a hugely debated and contested area. I'm not going into those controversies. So Marx identifies two primary elements of modes of production. One is the forces of production and the other one is relations of production. Now this forces of production is again subdivided into two. One is the means of production and the second one is the labor power. Now mode of production generally denotes a discernible economic order, one defined by the manner in which human beings mobilize the labor necessary to fulfill their basic needs. Something that we elaborated earlier. How human beings, one defined by the manner in which human beings mobilize the labor necessary to fulfill their basic needs. How do they socially organize? Who does what? That kind of an argument is what is understood as the mode of production. So there are several different modes of production have appeared throughout history, including slavery, feudalism and capitalism. And Marx speaks about Asiatic mode of production, which again created a lot of controversy, because whether he is saying that the Asiatic mode of production is something so unique to this particular region, and if that is the case, how does it fit into his overall argument? There is major debates and controversies in that sense. Now, mode of production is composed of two factors: forces of production and relations of production, as we showed in the diagram. And now, relations of production is the social framework within which economic activity is carried out. The relations of production, the point that we came across here, the relations of production talk about the social framework within which the economic activity is carried out. What is a kind of a social relationship between people who are involved in productive activity? Is everybody does the same thing, or is there division of labor? Okay, if there is division of labor, what kind of who does what kind of work? What is the kind of a social relationship between the people who actually work and the people who control them? What is the relationship between the people who actually work on the field? For example, imagine in a slave society. So the slaves are the people who actually put in their manual work. What is the relationship between them and the people who own? And compare that situation with that of a capitalist society, a factory owner who employs workers who work in his factory, but he does not own the laborers. He actually pays them for their labor. So what is the kind of a social relationship between the people who actually work and people who do not use their physical labor? Now, forces of production, the other component in mode of production, has two components. One is means of production and the other one is the labor power. Now, means of production includes almost every material aspects that are necessary for your process of production, which includes land, tools, machinery and raw materials. And this again, that this differs from time to time. For an agricultural society where agriculture is the most important one, you need land. Land is the primary important one. You of course requires tools, mostly physical tools. And when you move to that of a capitalist society, land is not significant, whereas machinery and factory becomes important. And raw materials are important. When you move to that of a contemporary society which is characterized by, say, service economy, you don't really require land or factory, where you work in offices, you work on computers, you work on data, and that becomes your raw materials. Okay? So every stage has its own set of means of production. And the labor power, another constituent aspect, is indicative of various forms of productivity according to the skills, expertise and technical know-how of the workforce, heavily dependent on the technological advancements. We know that the very term labor does not tell you anything. A person who is working in an analytical firm, a person who is working in a software company, he uses his labor. But that is completely different from a laborer who works on the field using his physical labor. So how labor power, the kind of the quality of labor output, the quality of labor power, which is heavily influenced by technological advancements. You talk about skilled and unskilled labor, semi-skilled labor, expert labor, and all these things are important here. Now each mode of production creates the entire configuration of a society, engendering a definite mode of life. Okay? So Marxian argument is very interesting, fascinating. It's convincing to a large extent, because he argues that each of this mode of production produces a definite mode of life. Okay? Why is that your life during your social organization, the way you live in at the time of slavery, is quite different from the way in which you live in a capitalist society? Is it because ideas are different? No, Marx would argue that ideas are of course different, but they are the products of the changes in the productive forces. What individuals are, Marx asserts, depend on the material conditions of production, on what they produce and how they produce. In transforming the natural world through labor, individuals also transform themselves, changing their own nature, developing new powers and ideas, new modes of intercourse, new needs and new language. So Marx does not have an idea of a singular idea of humanity or singular idea of human beings which are unchanging from the beginning to that of the end, that of the contemporary times. So Marx argues that human beings change, their needs change, their outlook change, their ideas change, depending upon in which time period they are located in which productive process they are implicated in. And that's a powerful argument. That's an extremely powerful argument. On the basis of this economic structure, partly due to the power of the dominant class, there arise a corresponding legal and political superstructure and the forms of social consciousness. So we go back to this particular structure again. So Marx argues that your politics, your law, your ideology, your social norms and your literature, okay, your sense of what is good, what is bad, your sense of your consciousness, everything whatever you discuss in this superstructure is a product of your mode of production. It's a product of your of the character of the economic activity that you are in. So in that sense, Marx gives complete autonomy to this particular base, and then argues that this heavily influences or almost determines the kind of ideas and arguments that you develop. So the legal and the political superstructure and the forms of social consciousness. Okay, the modern laws, Marx would argue, could not have emerged at the time of slavery. The idea of human rights, the idea of individual rights, the idea of democracy, the idea of somebody choosing his or her own ruler could not have been emerged in a slavery, in a time of slavery. The cultural beliefs and social institutions make up the superstructure, according to Marx, including the state itself, typically function to stabilize the relations of production, promote the interest of the dominant class, and lend political and intellectual support to the existing economic system. So this is another powerful argument. Okay? It's not that the economy simply produces, or the base simply produces the corresponding legal and social superstructure, but it has a clear bias. It has a clear bias in favor of the dominant class. Because within the economy, the classes are not equal. The slaves and masters were not equal. The feudal serfs and the lords were not equal. The capitalist class, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat were not equal. So Marx would argue that the superstructure that is built on each of the specific mode of production is also not neutral. Rather, they are built to favor the powerful group in the economic realm. So they promote the interest of the dominant class and lend political and intellectual support to the existing economic system. So this is a point where Marx becomes extremely critical of each of the stages, and more so with that of capitalist system. And when we take up his discussion on state, it becomes very apparent that Marx understands state as really incapable of incapable of protecting the interest of the proletariat. He understands state as an entity that is by default supports and protects the interest of the bourgeoisie. Now it's a quote again from German ideology. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. A very, very powerful argument. You can just think about it. Okay? Why that we find certain ideas are as more convincing? Marx would argue that the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. That is, the class which is the ruling material forces of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has the control at the same time over the means of mental production. So that thereby, generally speaking, the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subjected to it. The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expressions of the dominant material relationships. The dominant material relationships grasped as ideas. Very, very powerful arguments in order to understand why certain ideas assume hegemonic character, why certain ideas are considered to be mostly accepted by others. And Marx argues that these ideas in themselves do not have existence. Rather, these ideas become powerful ideas only when they are produced by the most powerful sections. So that is why this very, very important quote. I am ending the class, today's class, with this important quote. It is not the consciousness that determines life, but life that determines consciousness. It's a major critique of Hegelian philosophy, but this is also central to Marxian scheme of things, where he argues it's the materialist argument that the consciousness is not determines. It is not consciousness that determines life, but life that determines consciousness. So this life, according to Marx, has to be understood by analyzing its economic aspects. Then you will see that how the powerful groups engaged in the process of production produce certain ideas, and these ideas of the powerful become the powerful ideas. So there is a clear connection between the dominant ideas and the dominant group, and Marx calls out our attention to understand this particular relationship between the social dominance of certain class and the dominating ideas. And he argues that there's a clear parallel between them. And this is something so central to understand how social status quo work and how social change can be brought in. The themes which we will discuss in the coming classes. So I'm winding up the session today, and we'll meet you in the next class. Thank you.